Hello, everybody. Good to see you here. Thank you for joining me for this really exciting stream. I saw the other day that Bob Dylan turned 80, and on the 24th of March, and I saw there was a number of various kind of shows in the media and also on YouTube giving appreciation to Dylan and what he had done and looking at his work. And Dylan's music has been a big part of, well, this sounds so cheesy, but a big part of my life. I've always enjoyed his music and found it very moving and challenging, and has it's been something that I've always just loved Dylan's music, and I wanted to do something which kind of paid tribute or was a wee token of appreciation for his wonderful work. And so today, what I wanted to do was draw out a connection I had realized was there between what Dylan did with some of his music and with Puritan attitudes to music. Now, you might think, what a strange connection that is. How on earth can you possibly make that sort of association? Well, it's not specifically to do with the lyrics or with the music per se, but how Dylan took a certain genre and tried to transform it in light of his religious beliefs. And we'll see the same thing with Kanye West too, as well. So before I get into it, just want to say hi to a few people in the chat. Good to see you, Matthew Sad. I don't know when that picture is from, I'm afraid. I was searching for pictures from 1976, and that came up, but it could be, as you say, 81, 82. And good to see you, Lady of Shalott. Really glad you could join me today, and look forward to your comments moving forward. So let's jump straight in. So before we get to Dylan, I'd really like to begin with early modern Scottish Protestantism. This is the area that I do most of my research on, and I've been recently studying the attitudes towards music that early modern Scottish Protestants had, and they're very similar to Puritan attitudes. They're not the same groups, if that makes sense. Puritans are mainly found in England and North America during the same time period. And the time period we're talking about is the late 16th century, early to mid 17th century here. So you could say 1580 to 1640, something like that. Just a bit of background. At this point, Scotland had been a reformed Protestant nation for about 30 to 40 years. What that means is that in 1560, the Protestantism became the official religion of Scotland by an act of Parliament. And over that period, it was certainly a rocky road, but the institutions were set up so that for most Scottish people, their experience of parish worship was Protestant. To varying degrees, how successful that's implemented was dependent on your situation with your minister, whether you had a Kirk session, what part of Scotland you lived in, and so on. But by the 1590s, at least in lowland Scotland, most of that had been set up. There was functioning preaching ministry in most parishes, and they were catechizing their parishioners in Reformed doctrine, and worship was thoroughly reformed. There was metrical psalm singing, vernacular prayers, Bible readings in the vernacular, and then listening to sermons. At this point, 1590, with it being Protestantism being thoroughly established at a systemic level and in local and national politics, ministers and zealous Scots started turning towards the question of engaging with wider culture, so moving beyond just within the religious sphere, you might say, or matters to do with public worship, and starting to engage more and more with how can we reform society at large. This has always been an issue for Scottish Protestants like John Knox, but they were just unable to do it, and their attention had to be on how to change public worship from Catholic to Protestant. Now they have the resources to start imposing Reformed Protestant values upon society at large. And so one area that came up time and again is music. Scotland, like many countries in early modern Europe, was a very musical society. Contemporary eyewitness reports talk about blacksmiths, farmers, tradespeople. Everywhere you went, people were singing, whistling away, in part to ease their labours, but also as a form of entertainment and recreation. You'd find it in houses, domestic spaces, in the workplace, in the market, but also in the recreational places like the tavern, or at weddings and dances and so on. One of the key forms of music was the ballad, or what's known as the Broadside Ballots, because they were printed on these broadsides, which were very cheap, often in London, and balladeers or minstrels and singers would go around various towns, and they would be in a marketplace or in a tavern, and they would sing these songs, and they might gather a crowd around them. You have to remember, this is in a time period when you didn't have YouTube or even CDs or record players. Every piece of music has to be performed live. And so these balladeers would go from town to town singing, or maybe a minstrel playing these songs, and then they would sell these broadsides to those listening, if the audience liked the tune. And that's an important point. Most people couldn't read during this period either. So the way that music was communicated was orally. It wasn't that they read these texts and then learnt the songs. Most people had to learn by ear. This meant that people's memories were so much better than they are today. They could really grasp a melody well. And if they liked a melody, that would certainly boost the popularity of a song. Part of what this meant was that tunes could often be associated with a number of texts. You might have one tune, such as Greensleeves, for example, and many sets of words would be set to it, because people had a very good memory for tunes. And balladeers would think, well, if I put this new set of words to a tune that's already loved by this people, they're going to buy my broadsides. So you end up with a lot of different texts set to the same tune. And this is called a process of contrafactum, setting a new text to established or old melody. So Scotland was a very musical society. Probably the main form was the broadside ballad, particularly love ballads or ballads to do with romantic desire, love songs and so on. So not much has changed in that regard with popular music. And it should be said as well that this wasn't just like a popular thing or a low-level plebeian thing, if you were. There was a lot of engagement from the court with broadside ballads. Court poets and musicians would often take these songs and transform them or arrange them for a court setting. And in early modern Scotland, James VI, he styled himself as a Renaissance humanist musician. And he assembled a court of poets and musicians to write part songs and engage in the creation of culture. And while he was in Scotland, the court was the engine of musical production. And what's interesting here is that at the same time, the music of the court would often flow back into popular spheres. The music that was written by somebody like Alexander Montgomery and his poetry would often find its way into a popular arena. This might be through the landed classes or wealthy classes, particularly in Edinburgh, the merchants or noble houses where they would share these things. And from there, it would flow down into maybe a broader audience. So there was a lot of interchange. It wasn't just elite and lay music totally cut off. Actually, there was a lot of conversation between the two. So there was a lot of music in early modern Scotland. And the Protestant Kirk, the Protestant Church, many of its leading ministers had various opinions on the effect of such music upon their congregations. And we could say that there was at least two major points of view in this regard. The first was articulated by Robert Rolick. Rolick was the first principal of the University of Edinburgh, which was set up in 1583 as a new Calvinist college to train ministers in Edinburgh. Things have changed a lot since then. And Rolick argued fundamentally that pop music of his day should be totally destroyed and replaced with holy hymnody and psalm music. Now, why did he think this? Well, for two reasons. The first is that and I'm going to quote him here, that the melodies the melodies, which are light and wanton tunes, mistune the affections. What Rollick's saying here, and I'm going to unpack it in quite some detail in a second, is that the melodies of ballads, particularly ballads, love ballads, evoke in the audience desires, emotions, so on, which are evil, which mislead us, which lead to sin. This sort of view has its roots in classical philosophies of music from Pythagoras, Plato, and Aristotle. And they each had their own various views on this question, the philosophy of music. And there's kind of two broad strands. The Pythagorean approach, we could say, as a kind of following idea that music is a set of mathematical proportions, or at least you can map music mathematically. And when a piece of music has mathematical relative proportion, or the kind of notes and chords have relative proportion to one another, this is what brings about harmony. Now, for Pythagoras, or Pythagorean philosophy, we should say, this mathematical reality of music matches the mathematical order of the creation, of the cosmos. So we often talk of the harmony of the spheres. For Pythagoras, the mathematical proportion of the various planets and stars and so on are such, they have such order, like music does, that they actually generate music. And so what instrumental music does is, when it is good music, that is, it creates harmony, or is a kind of harmony, it works in our soul's order, i.e. harmony. And this aligns our souls with the harmony or order of the cosmos. Now, this is when music has good order or good harmony. A lot of music is not harmonious, it is dissonant. That is when those mathematical proportions, well, they're not good proportions, they're actually out of proportion with one another, these notes and rhythms and so on. When dissonance occurs, our souls are put out of order, and thus we are left out of order with the cosmos. We are unaligned. An important point here is, for Pythagoras, music embodies emotion or manifests emotion. It doesn't just cause emotion in us, rather, each has its own flavor, or kind of manifests a kind of attitude. So some music is literally the sonic version of courage, or of bravery, or nobility. Others might be to do with romantic desire, others actually manifest fear, and so on. And you can actually determine this mathematically by studying the mathematical nature of a piece of music. And this is where Pythagoras' idea of the 7 modes of music comes in. Each mode has its own emotional content because of its tune has a set of relative proportions which locate it as a kind of emotion. Thus, what you can say then is, depending on the kind of emotion a piece of music is and works in its audience, can determine whether it realigns the soul with the universe. That's one way of thinking about it. The other way, which is more Aristotelian, is to see music as a kind of motion. All music has movement in it insofar as you move through a piece, the pitches go up and down, and the rhythms are faster and slower. So there's a kind of motion. And Roger Scruton, who's the biggest proponent, I think, of this view in contemporary philosophy of music, he makes the point that we don't just hear sound when we listen to a piece of music. We hear it moving from one point to another in a kind of imagined space. And that movement has in its character a certain emotional quality. It's not just that we imagine it as emotive. We don't just see these sounds as emotive from our own point of view. The sounds themselves in that sequence have the character of a certain emotion. He makes the point of Elgar's music having the quality of nobility within it. It's not just something we imagined we heard, and so on. So in either Pythagorean or Aristotelian view, music manifests an emotion. And in both of their views, when somebody hears a piece of music, it works in the listener the same emotion that it embodies. So when you listen to Elgar, according to someone like Aristotle, the nobility of the piece transforms your emotions to a certain nobility. And so when you take that logic, Plato took it probably the furthest. You should only encourage forms of music which work in their audience a kind of, desired emotions. So Rolick here is arguing that love ballads, which most Scots are listening to, are working in them emotions which are not good, specifically sexual desires or overpowerful sexual desires. And many ministers were quite concerned from their own experience that when inflamed in passion, it's going to lead to temptation and thus fornication and adultery, two of the biggest offences that churches were trying to eradicate during this time. So that's one of the reasons why Rolick was objecting to this sort of music, or love balladry, was because of its tunes. The second is its words. And Alexander Hume, a fellow minister, put the point quite well for Rolick, is that the lyrics of these love ballads often incense a person's lusts. Why? Because of their examples. What they describe has an effect upon the soul. It's a mobilizing thing. It stirs up those desires which, for these ministers, thought was wrong. Now, in both cases, the tune and the words, according to this sort of argument, stir up evil desires. Now, we need to know something further here, and it will be relevant to the Dylan stuff later. In early modern Scotland, the devil, Satan, was thought to work in a person directly. He wasn't just an external reality out there in the world, although he very much was. He was actually within the soul. And he could manipulate the emotions within the soul, taking the fallen soul, because in Reformed Protestantism, since the sin of Adam, everybody's faculties are corrupted in some way or another. The devil works on them and tries to stir them up. He does this by tempting, by creating doubts, and so on. And so ministers like Rolick and Hume implicitly thought that these love ballads, because they stir up sexual desire, are themselves instruments of the devil. This was often seen in the fact that witch trial confessions from around this period involve music. I should mention that there was a common belief that witchcraft, or at least the Reformed Protestant Kirk tried to advocate the belief that witchcraft was based on the power of Satan. So you find in 1596, in Aberdeen witch trial confessions, for example, that a group of witches were alleged to have been dancing to the devil's music and then fornicating with him. So there's an implicit connection here between the satanic and music which stirs up sexual desire or overwrought sexual desire. So that's one view. And Rolick then thought, well, if such music is doing these things, it needs to be completely destroyed. We need to replace it with music which is going to stir up godly affections. And that, in his view, were the Psalms, being their lyrics were the word of God, and their music was actually composed to try and imitate what the lyrics said themselves. So it was trying to express in a melodic form the lyrical content of the Psalms. But there was another view during this period which was advocated by a number of Scottish Presbyterians. Particularly during the 1590s, there was a group in Fife and in Edinburgh who were writing a lot of their own poetry, particularly godly poetry, often to do with the praise of God and their own spiritual journeys. And it was of a good quality. This wasn't slapdash. It was technically quite excellent examples of poetry. And some of these figures, what they would do is, rather than just ignore popular music, which they very much loved the melodies of, they sought to attempt sacra contrafacta. So if you remember a few minutes ago, I spoke about how balladeers would often set new texts to popular tunes because these tunes were memorable and it would help them sell their songs. Well, these Scottish Presbyterians would take these melodies and set them to new holy lyrics. This view implicitly had the idea that tunes, and James Melville, a really key minister, was the main advocate of this point of view. Tunes certainly work in us emotion, but for somebody like James Melville, what they do is empower our love for whatever the lyrics direct us towards. So in some ways, the music itself is morally neutral. It doesn't. It'll only bolster whatever emotion is evoked by the words. So if you set these tunes to holy and godly lyrics, they can do a good thing because they can bolster the creation of those new emotions that are such as love of God, love of neighbor, and so on. But if they're set to lyrics which cultivate evil desires, such as those love ballads we've just been discussing, then the music will enhance those evil desires. So a number of them engaged in this approach, and it was inspired by actually some pre-Reformation music, affectionately known as the good and godly ballads, which and I should say as well, this wasn't just unique to Scottish Protestantism. Martin Luther in Germany used this technique frequently to try and convert German culture from Catholicism to Protestantism, taking Catholic tunes and popular tunes and setting new Protestant lyrics to them. So it's an attempt to kind of transform and change culture, but not having a total discontinuity, taking elements of it and reworking it into a new context and framework. I want to give you a quick example of this, and because it'll help us when we get to Bob Dylan's music. So there was one of the key figures here is a woman called Elizabeth Melville. No relation to James Melville. Elizabeth Melville was a Scottish Presbyterian, and she was a prominent member of the most radical circle. She was involved with a number of ministers and zealous people who opposed King James's ecclesiastical reforms, many of them exiled, some sent to the Tower of London. So this was a persecuted group, and she was an important member, cultivating support for those who were in prison. She was a mentor to many of the next generation. She traveled widely, and she shared a lot of pastoral and caring advice. So she was an important person in establishing a reactionary network, you might say. And one of the key aspects that she had is she wrote a lot of poetry, really brilliant poetry, actually. Some of it was printed and as Ain Godly Dream. And this dream poem was published in Scotland and England on multiple occasions, and was thought to be an inspiration for John Bunyan's A Pilgrim's Progress. So she was quite an important figure, and one of the things that she did is she would take popular ballads that she had heard, or popular forms of music, and rework them into godly forms, taking the tunes and setting new text to them. One of them was a tune known as Solsequium by Alexander Montgomery. Montgomery was a Roman Catholic who was really important in the court of James VI. He was a key member of it, and for a long time was good friends with the king and writing poems backwards and forwards. And probably one of his most popular during his life was the Solsequium. It's a kind of love song to do with unrequited love, or the pain of a love which is absent. And what I'm going to do now, I would have played this, but I'm kind of thinking it's likely that I will get copyright strike. I'm going to try my best to avoid that stream. So I'm just going to sing a couple of verses from it, and then we'll look at the Melville one as a comparison. So apologies if this is going to be deafening. I hope it won't be. I've tried to set it up so it won't. But here we go. Like as the dumb Solsequium with care o'ercome does sorrow when the sun goes out of sight, hings down his heed and droops as deed, nor will not spread, but locks his leaves to languor all the night, till foolish fate rise with whip in hand to purge the crystal skies and licht the land. Birds in their bower wait tis for their tour, and to their prince in glad good morrow gives. Fra then at floor list not in Lord, but laughs on Phoebus losing out his leaves. So stand this with me, except I be, where I may see my lamp or licht, my lady and my love. For as she departs in thousand depths, in sundry heads, fearless through my heavy heart, but restore all. My countenance declares my inward grief, and hope almost despairs to find relief. I dwine, place does me pine, I loathe on everything I look and lace, till Titan mine upon me shine, that I revive the favour of her face. So those two verses, and there's a few more verses, but we don't need to look at those. Montgomery's voice here is essentially saying that there's an individual who, when their love is away, they are in a state of grief. They're almost like they're going to die. So it's a song about love sickness, about how they cannot go on without their love being there. And when the sun rises is what it's like when their love returns, and it brings joy to them. It brings life to them, as it were. So this is very much a song which encourages a view that intense romantic feeling is a good thing, and that actually, even though it's painful, this is something which is noble, which is good to have. So what I'm going to do now is sing just the first verse of Elizabeth Melville's reworking of this song. Her father was ambassador for the Scottish court, and thus she had access to a lot of the music being produced there, including Alexander Montgomery's Solsequium. She might have even heard him in person or heard versions of this being performed. So this song, which is from a manuscript that was found with a lot of her poetry in, is it's a reworking of this melody to Psalm 51, verse 15. So here is Melville's reinterpretation. O God above, should not thy love and mercies move my soul and all the powers of my heart, while I have days to pen thy praise and show always thy works, thy wondrous works in every part. Oh, how can it be thought thy great mercy, that all the world has wrought for us only? The earth, the air, the heaven so fair, the stars into the firmament so bright, the sun, the moon, glancing aboon, to cause the earth to glister with her light. So what Melville's done here, I think, is quite clever. She's not just taking the tune, she's actually relying upon your knowledge of the Solsequium for her song to really impact you. Because if you remember with the Solsequium, the singer is in a state of melancholy because their love's not here. And what they're hoping for is that their love will return, and this will revive them, this will give them new life and vigor. Melville's singer is actually saying, well, what should revive me is thinking about God and God's love for me. And even when I don't feel God is present, it's the experience of God's goodness which should revive me. And it's interesting that she specifically mentions that God created the sun and the moon, which both appear in the Solsequium as metaphors for how, when the sun returns, when the sun rises, that has the same kind of energizing effect as your love returning. So Melville's definitely reworking the Soul Sequiem here, and her key point through this, she's attempting to sanctify Montgomery's melody. She's trying to turn it into a holy thing, which will inspire holy emotions, or godly emotions. So those were the two attitudes at play: demolition of popular music or sanctifying popular music in early modern Scotland. And the Puritans, for a limited time, had both. After the 1590s in Puritan England met with very little success or popular reception, the Puritans moved towards destruction of popular music, replacing it totally with psalm singing. And that sort of attitude can be seen in their banning of Christmas and so on. By contrast, in Scotland, this approach kept going in Scotland for a while, but it the problem, a large part of the problem, was the court moved to England, and that killed the creative spark in Scotland. It destroyed the central hub and resources which allowed for musical creativity, and thus it regressed somewhat. So nobody really thought, though, from this religious point of view, that we could just allow such music. Right? Nobody was particularly happy with the music in their society because they believed it was stirring up evil desires and thus evil behavior. So bear these thoughts in mind as we now move towards Bob Dylan and how he saved the blues, as it were. So before we get to Dylan, let's just think about what the blues is. Blues is a style of music which kind of emerged in 1930s America, and it had a lot of associations with black music and kind of the Delta, Deep South, and so on. And one of the key figures within kind of the origin of the blues was Robert Johnson. I'm not going to share any music from Johnson today because I checked, and like every video on YouTube has some kind of license linked to it, so I'm sure that would get us taken down. But many of Johnson's songs were very influential in the formation of the blues. But around Johnson has always been the notion or the mythology of the devil. So the legend has it that Johnson, of the Crossroads, that's right, Lady of Shalott. So the legend has it that Johnson one night went to the Crossroads. He was always trying to get a lift from the Crossroads or so on, and he met the devil, appearing as a large black man. And the devil gave Johnson the ability to master and play and sing the blues. And part of this, I think, is embedded in Johnson's own music. Some of the lyrics that I came across have quite clearly mentioned the devil. So one of his songs, Me and the Devil Blues, I'll just read a bit of it for you. Early this morning, when you knocked upon my door, early this morning, when you knocked upon my door, and I said, hello, Satan, I believe it's time to go. Me and the devil was walking side by side. Me and the devil, was walking side by side. And I'm going to beat my woman until I get satisfied. So with Johnson, there is even in his own words, beyond the mythology, there's a connection between his Hellhound as well. That's right, Matthew Sad. There is a connection between his music and the satanic. And just beyond this idea of the music of explicit satanic reference, we have the fact that a lot of blues music promotes sex, drugs, alcoholism, etc., etc. These are some of the main themes beyond being kind of down and out and so on, is the kind of prioritization of these sorts of things, this sort of life. One of the key influences here, or an important example, would be something like Muddy Waters, Champagne, and Reefer. And I'm going to now try and share my screen and show you a video, just a wee bit of it, and you'll get the idea. I'm a bit of a boomer when it comes to this, so give me a second, and hopefully this is going to work. Hopefully that came through. I'm not sure if it did, but hopefully you heard that. So the lyrics are, give me a champagne when I'm thirsty, give me a reefer when I want to get high, so that smoke some dope. And when I get lonely, put a woman here down by my side. So the lyrics here are basically telling us, like, if you have a need, fulfill it. If you have any kind of bodily desire, fulfill it. And that's part of the blues, is that sort of authenticity of life. Just be real in that regard. Get rid of all the fluff, get rid of all the hypocrisy and so on. Just live that kind of authentic, going where your desires lead you. It's very energizing, and you can see it not just in Muddy Waters but others. Howlin' Wolf, John Lee Hooker. There's elements in all of them. There's very little ever of kind of the transcendent or anything of that nature in the blues. Kind of the good, the true, and the beautiful. Maybe the true perhaps. And maybe you can see this in the music itself. One of the things that I thought is really interesting in that clip is the way that the notes bend. The guitar bends the notes here. It's not just a straight playing. There's a real emphasis on bending and shifting the note upwards and downwards in a way that kind of pushes the boundaries, is very powerful, but also maybe is, for a Pythagorean, this would be the worst thing ever, because it's destroying the harmonies that have been created and creating tension within the music, thus destroying the order of the music. Now, whether or not this is too strong a case, perhaps we'll debate that later. But you could see in the very fabric of this melody, or in the backing, is a kind of transgression of the melodic order in some ways. And maybe that's tied to this profligacy with sex, drugs, and booze. It's a going beyond not just the musical order, but the cultural values of 1930s to 60s America. And you can certainly see that with its development Some of you in the chat have already mentioned how the blues is a massive influence on rock and roll. Lady of Charlotte has mentioned the Rolling Stones and Eric Clapton, but we could also mention Led Zeppelin, The Doors, The Who, AC/DC. The list goes on and on. So many are inspired in various ways by blues music, not just in terms of its themes or melodically, but just in the whole kind of style, the culture of it. And certainly isn't the old catchphrase sex, drugs, and rock and roll bound up with that. And the 60s rock music is in many ways a continuation of celebrating those values of having lots of sex, having lots of drugs, and playing good music along the side with it. The music's bound up in that context. The interesting thing here too, though, is that in that such rock music is a strong satanic element. And I don't mean that in a kind of hokey-cokey sort of way, or like necessarily that these people are worshipping the devil. I don't think that's the case, although I might be wrong. But rather that Satan is a key, or their values are matched up with Satan because he is the ultimate figure of rebellion. So think of the Rolling Stones' Sympathy for the Devil, or You've Beaten Me to It, Lady of Shalott, Highway to Hell by AC/DC, Hell's Bells would be another one. Black Sabbath, the very name Black Sabbath is tied to the kind of witches in the UK with Crowley and so on, Mr. Crowley, etc., etc. So there's all of these things are connected in the blues and rock and roll, and certainly Dylan, whose mastery and knowledge of blues and other forms of music and rock and roll, which he was a part of, he would have been fully aware of many of these connections over his life. And I guess one of the things that makes Dylan's 60s and 70s music so interesting to many of us is that it didn't just fall into celebrating all of these things. Certainly not in the ways that other bands did and do. So this brings us nicely to how Dylan attempted to save the blues, as it were. So Dylan converted to evangelical Christianity. This was a decisive moment in his life. Evangelical Christianity, roughly stated, be the belief that God, through Jesus Christ, saves sinners by grace through faith. Now, the Bible is the word of God. It should be should be followed, and it's a very robust Christianity which emphasizes converting others to your following. When Dylan converted, it influenced his music significantly, and he wrote a number of Christian songs and Christian albums such as Infidels and Slow Train and so on. And these, we should be clear, they weren't hymns he was writing, so they weren't songs designed to address God. Rather, they were songs addressing human beings and trying to convince them in one way or another to follow God or express something about following God, by and large. So they were songs that were aimed to convert people. They were missionary songs in many ways. This isn't such a departure because much of Dylan's earlier work had a similar role, but in a political sense. It was trying to convert people to become part of his political movements, etc. So, well, you could see something like, like Blowing in the Wind. that is a missionary song, but just not a Christian missionary song. These later songs were in their own way carrying on that tradition, but from a specifically evangelical point of view. And arguably one of the most famous ones, or most explicit ones, is Bob Dylan's Gotta Serve Somebody. And what I'm going to do just now is I'm going to try and share a wee bit of one of his performance of it. And this performance was at the Golden Globes. So in a place where there's hundreds of celebrities and musicians and so on, famous people, a seat of cultural power, and he sings Gotta Serve Somebody. So just going to do that now.
Champion of the world. You made me a socialite with a long speed move, but you'll have to serve somebody. Yes, indeed, serve somebody. Well, it may be the devil, or it may be the Lord, but you'll have to serve somebody.
Yeah, so that is one of my favorite performances, and if you've not seen that, just type in to YouTube Bob Dylan Gotta Serve Somebody. It's well worth a listen. So this song is a blues song essentially, and we can see this in its structure. So if you want to think about the blues for a second, what kind of music it is, probably the most famous or kind of established format is the 12 bars blues. It's made up of 3 chords. Every key is made up of, has kind of 8 notes in its scale, and the first note of that scale is called the tonic, and that's just whatever note the key is in. So if we're talking about the key of C, the tonic, or chord 1, is C, which is made up of C, E, and G. It's a triad. Every chord here is a triad. So the first 4 bars of the 12-bar blues are C. And then when you get to bar 5, it moves to chord 4, which in the key of C is F. So F, A, and D, that's what makes up that chord. 2 bars of that, subdominant, which is what it's also called. And then you move back to C for 2 bars, chord number 1, the tonic. Then when you get to bar 8, you're moving to the dominant, which is chord 5 in the key of C, so that's G. And then down to F, F, A, and C again, and then down to C. So 12-bar blues would sound something like this. So Gotta Serve Somebody is a variation of this format. It's in the 16-bar blues. And basically that just means you do the tonic for at the chord number 1 for 8 bars at the beginning rather than 4. So it's just extending that. And Dylan's playing it in harmonic A minor. I think it is. I had to double check this. I'm not totally sure on my minor keys, but I think it's A minor. So that's this. So that's that note. And what he's going to do is he really loves to really get into the bluesiness of this. So for his subdominant, it's going to be a D7. So what that means is you have the notes that I described before. So you have D. You have A. You have F. But you're also going to put in a C. The C is the 7th note of D, of the key of D. And what that does is it introduces tension into the chord. So this would be a normal D chord. This would be a D7. And what the C is doing, it's a leading note. It wants to lead you back to the main note, or travel back to the tonic, which in this case would be the A minor. And you'll do the same with the dominant and the subdominant again. So Dylan's You Gotta Serve Somebody. It goes, Everything's Broken, another Dylan song. It would go something like this. You may be an ambassador for England or France. You may like to gamble, you may like to dance. You may be the heavyweight champion of the world. You may be a socialite with a long string of pearls, but you gotta serve somebody. Yes, indeed, you gotta serve somebody. It may be the devil, it may be the Lord, you're gonna have to serve somebody. So you can see it's a classic blues chord progression here. But what's interesting is the combination of these lyrics with this musical style. Because Dylan, knowing the history of the blues and its association with Satan at its very origin, but also with its promotion of values or a way of life which conflicts with the Christian view, which promotes sensuality in a way that transgresses the laws of God. Dylan takes that. He knows you know this as well, implicitly at some level. And he puts it to lyrics which say you can either serve Satan or you can serve God, as in Jesus Christ. There are only two options. So he's claiming the blues and its music for God. He's taking it into that larger perspective. He's reconquering it. He's winning it over for that. And he's also playing off the idea that the blues songs are about truth, about honest living. And this song's, if you think of the context he's singing it in there, to a room filled with superstars, celebrities, and so on, he's challenging them. He's telling them the truth, as he's done in all of his music, tried to tell the truth. In this case, it's that it doesn't matter who you are. You could be all of these different people. In verse 2, it's you might be a rock and roll addict prancing on the stage. Does that not sound like Mick Jagger or Jim Morrison or someone? You might have drugs at your command, women in a cage. You may be a businessman or some high-degree thief. They may call you doctor, or they may call you chief. Could be the president. Doesn't matter. Everybody serves. What's interesting here, though, as well, is he's not saying just everybody serves in general. It's not just that people serve kind of human masters, which I think is how many people want to take this song. That, oh, well, you serve, the elites. All people always serve some group of elites. He's not saying that here. He's also not saying that you serve some kind of value system. Actually, what matters here is that you either serve the devil or you serve God in what you do. And Dylan's trying to take this blues music and put it into the service of God by speaking the truth, as it were. So that's one example. I want to give you another example and of kind of Dylan doing this. And this is from one of my favorite performances as well. And it's from the song Man of Peace, which I think for today is so challenging to so many values that I have today. So I'm just going to play you a bit from a performance from 1987, and then we'll discuss a few of the words. So let's get this over again. So this one is a more typical 12-bar blues with the same chord progression that we discussed, and it's I think it's just super clever because what Dylan's building off the idea from the Bible that the devil can appear as an angel of light. You see, Tolkien used this idea with Sauron as well in the Silmarillion, that often Satan can appear in things which seem to us beautiful, which can appear to us good. And that would include the blues, for example. So he's taking something which has been naturally associated with Satan, which many people enjoy, and he's using it to expose Satan's approaches. And this I think is again highlighted in verse 2. Which we heard. He got a sweet gift to gab. He's got a harmonious tongue. He knows every song of love that has ever been sung. That ever has been sung. Sorry. So the satanic Dylan, Satan can use all of these things to move our emotions in destructive ways. And so by reclaiming it for Christianity, he's sanctifying, he's purifying the song in much the same way that Elizabeth Melville tried to sanctify and purify the songs of Alexander Montgomery and others from that period. I just wanted to read another verse from this song because I think it relates to a lot of things happening at the moment. He's a great humanitarian. He's a great philanthropist. He knows just where to touch you, honey, and how you like to be kissed. He'll put both his arms around you. You can feel the tender touch of the beast. You know that sometimes Satan comes as a man of peace. The idea that those who present themselves as charitable and giving and trying to do the best for the world, that in itself is quite a challenge today. And also, so then the second aspect is in sexuality. Again, Dylan wants to bring it back to this, that, the blues and rock and roll has been promoting kind of fornication and so on. And Dylan's saying here, well, you can have all of those things. Satan will give you all of those things. But that doesn't mean it's good. So that is, in some ways, how Dylan tried to save the blues. And I've put that in inverted commas because it's not about saving the blues as a genre in the sense of great musicianship or so on, but I'm sure in some ways he did. Rather, it's more to do with how Dylan sought to sanctify the blues. He sought to reform them for the glory of God, and by extension, rock and roll during this period. Now, certainly much of Dylan's music has somewhat receded from this very strongly missional approach that Dylan had during this period. But some of his later work still has, or to me, comes from that Christian perspective, even if it's not as kind of missional. It's still a Christian perspective Dylan writes with. I think you can particularly see this in something like I Pay in Blood, but Not My Own, as a song. Because, well, many of the critics at the time were horrified by this sentiment and thought, well, Dylan must be kind of seeing himself as some kind of mob boss or gangster who's really violent. But for the Christian, and much of that song has kind of references to biblical passages, the Christian pays in the blood of Christ for their sins. And so that is Dylan's playing off that in part in that song. I was going to mention too here that Dylan's not the only high-profile person to have attempted this. Probably the most recent example is Kanye West's album. Kanye West, very different from Dylan in some ways. Very different genre, rap music and R&B. But he's always seen himself as a bit different and trying to lyrically engage in a way superior to others of his genre. And with Jesus is King, his album Jesus is King, he sought to use such music for the glory of God. And it's interesting that he chose the title Jesus is King, because what's that referring to? Well, the lordship of Christ over all creation. So it's not just Jesus is your Lord on a Sunday service, or it's not just the king of your religious life. If Jesus is king, he's king over everything, and he is master over everything. He is the elite over everything. If that's the case, he is also the king of R&B. And so Kanye, in his own way, is trying to reflect that in that album. So it's a similar idea to what Dylan was trying to do with the blues and rock and roll. So they're very much taking that point of view that Melville and co had, that you can sanctify the blues, you can sanctify music, because music in itself does not evoke certain emotions. It's the lyrics and the context in which they're played which make the key difference. So this leads us to a number of questions that I think this discussion can open up, or has opened up. And then once I kind of raise some of these questions, we'll get into the chats and look over what people have been saying, and then also if there's any kind of further questions or comments or just general thoughts. So the key issue, at least for all of these figures, who are all Christian that we've discussed, they're all Christian, but it could be other religions as well, is a relationship between religion or kind of ideology and culture, specifically musical culture. But you could extend this to debates about kind of film, TV, books, and so on. What is that relationship? How should they relate together? So the first question from a religious point of view is, how should you engage with culture? Is it like these Scottish Presbyterians, Dylan, and Kanye? Should you be trying to convert culture, or should you be creating your own culture, which is independent, or replacing such a culture? If you do think that your role is to try and transform culture towards a set of moral laws or norms with a higher goal in mind, how do you go about doing that? Is it by taking new lyrics and applying them to kind of popular musical forms? Could it be the other way around? Could you take a set of lyrics and set them to a new set of music? Or do you just have to create your own kind of music, like the metrical psalms? Is it even possible to do this? So I mentioned earlier that there may be something intrinsic to the blues which is transgressive of moral order, because it in its own way at points transgresses the kind of musical order. Yeah. If that's the case, well, can you ever lose that aspect of it? Is it intrinsic to the music or not? Second question is, well, in both of the cases we looked at, with Dylan and Elizabeth Melville, they both recognized that their audiences would remember the connotations of those melodies that they were listening to, their kind of sexual connotations or their love connotations or whatever, and then use that to kind of, they were trying to channel that in a new direction. But is that possible? Will people be moved enough by what this new form of music to have that music change how it impacts them? I guess a kind of further question is context here. So when Dylan starts playing blues here, he's changed quite considerably, and he's not. Well, let's use a contrast here. When Mick Jagger and Jim Morrison are singing the blues, they're doing so in a context where we all know that they're getting high all the time and having lots of sex and so on, and basically trying to be as rebellious as possible. So that's the context which they're playing the blues, and the music itself and the lyrics that they're singing are bolstered by that. We know what the values implicit are because of the person who's performing it. When Bob Dylan performs it as an evangelical Christian, that in itself changes the way we engage with the blues music. We know the origin of, or the motivation from why it's being played at all. So that might change it. But does that get away from the? So the question here is does music have an intrinsic emotional value to it? If not, can the history or context that it's being played in change or be altered in such a way that you can change its value? I think in general, it's not worked as an approach. Certainly in the examples I've given, while Melville may have had some success among her followers and networks, and while Dylan obviously made lots of sales, it hasn't really changed the fundamental values of rock and roll. And it didn't change the fundamental values of love balladry during 16th and 17th century Scotland. So that in itself is indicative that these kind of individual cases didn't make much dent on the musical industry, in part because they are fighting a whole economic system here and political system being backed by the media and so on. Certainly in Dylan's case, in early modern Scotland, it would be the ballad broadside printers and the composers and so on who are trying to appeal to their markets. They would have been, if they thought it was in their interest, which some of them did, write religious versions of songs, but in general, love songs were the biggest sellers in early modern England and probably in early modern Scotland, unless there's less evidence on that point. But the same is true also in Dylan's era, right? That he's trying to sanctify the blues and rock and roll. Well, meanwhile, there's tons of blues and rock and roll which are not advocating a Christian point of view, which are dominating the market, and it wouldn't change unless the content providers change, and there's no reason for them to change. They're making a lot more money this way. So I think that's probably part of the weakness of this approach. It does work in Luther's Germany to a large extent, and that's where you get, and I think that in itself is interesting, that Luther's hymns take off in a big way in that culture and come to be a key pillar in the formation of a new Protestant community in Germany. But that's in a context where the whole kind of ecclesiastical machine, backed by various state powers, is imposing this change upon popular culture in a way that you're not seeing in early modern Scotland or in the blues scene that Dylan's trying to impact here. So that in itself feeds back into this idea that cultural change on that level isn't possible with just small individual or voluntary associations. Those groups need the support, not just of the state, but of key institutions, which will support bankroll these changes in a way that and safeguards them too. I think that's the other point here. So those are just some general thoughts, and I think this sort of debate is a kind of microcosm of larger debates, as we've kind of been indicated here, about a number of things. One is just whether music has a moral, could be judged morally. People are often quite offended if you tell them that their music is evil, or that it stimulates a corrupt society. You can also question whether the aesthetic can be judged as better or worse. People get even more offended if you say some music is just bad music. Roger Scruton often spoke about this in that many of his students just couldn't understand how some music could be worse than others, that it was wrong to judge such a thing. Now that in itself has been, that sort of attitude has been created by years and years of cultural change in this sort of liberal tradition we live in now. But that was alien to an early modern person. They thought you could judge whether music was morally good and aesthetically good because they're one and the same thing. Another question is, should the church be trying to transform society, or for that matter, any ideological voluntary association of people? So it doesn't just have to be church, it could be a reactionary movement, a left-wing movement, so on. What should they be trying to transform? What kinds of music people listen to, or what they're consuming? And that's tied to ideas about education. as well. And education being more than just information, but emotional education, transforming desires, shaping desires into a certain direction for the well-being of an individual. You see this implicitly with bias training, right? The idea that we have certain prejudices that need to be counteracted is a recognition, even whether we debate how right it is, that the need of emotional education in some way or another. So there's that aspect to this debate too. And then just more broadly, how far is it possible to change people's attitudes or emotions through music? All of these people assume that it has quite an impact, and I think they're probably on the right lines there. And then more broadly, how is it possible to change musical culture and culture more generally? These people try to do that and ultimately have failed for the most part. And that in itself is interesting. What's gone wrong there, and what has gone right in other examples? Because it is remarkable how the rise of 60s music, rock and roll, and so on, most of the values that were touted then, which were transgressive of ordinary values of society, which is largely Christian, are now more than mainstay, at least in some ways. So yeah, those are just some thoughts that I had about this, and I appreciate the ending there was a bit kind of a jumble of different ideas. It's quite hard to work them out into separate categories because they're so interrelated in these contexts. So with all that, I'm going to now look over the chat and see what people have been saying throughout and responding. And if you have any questions or comments or ideas and thoughts, please feel free to add them in, and we'll see how we're going. I seem to have lost the beginning of it. How do I renew it? I don't know. 1 second, folks. I don't know. Does anybody know? I only have from 3:13, but I started 10 minutes earlier, so I think I've missed a fair bit. I don't know what that means, but I'll take your word for it. Okay, well, I'll go from where I've got. Hello, Great White Lobster. Thank you for joining. Always enjoy your contributions, and same here to Lady of Charlotte. I feel like I've missed half of a conversation here, so my apologies. I guess you're talking about like lockdown and things. Yeah, I'm not going to go into that on this stream. I think that's a big topic for something else. And I guess one thing you could question is, God, if we're going to try and tie it in, is well, music cultivates certain emotions, right, or certain attitudes, and that's what Elizabeth Melville and co recognized. That if you want to transform people and bring them into a position where they're going to love God, you have to transform what they listen to, the kinds of things they're consuming. And perhaps part of the problem here is that a large proportion of the people who, if you want to see people change, explaining to them why they're wrong on a certain issue isn't going to be persuasive for most people. They've already made up their minds. And it's often because of non-rational factors, such as emotion. So if we're going to see big changes in how people engage with society, with their rulers and so on, then you're going to have to change not just you can't just advocate an intellectual argument. There needs to be a transformation of music, transformation, and that was for early modern Scots. That was the only thing they really needed to challenge on a cultural level. We've got so many more. We've got television, film, music is so much is streamed now rather than communally performed. So there's that aspect too. There's social media. There's the tons of stuff on YouTube, so on and so forth. So perhaps that opens up a wider question. You see, of it's not just about intellectual argumentation. Transformation is going to require a whole rejuvenation of how people of what stimulates people's emotions, I guess. So I think that kind of ties into this, right? So the are essentially lazy. So what's made them lazy is the interesting question there, and how do you change that? And certainly that's tied up with the capitalist elements of all this, which companies sell their products on the basis that they'll give us pleasure a lot of the time. And they're very effective at getting us to buy products because we think they'll release dopamine for us. And many of these products are made in China. So yeah, I think there's wider questions there on that. I've only seen the beginning of this, but I would thoroughly recommend both really great thinkers, and I'm always amazed at how much Apostolic Majesty knows. He's so insightful as well. Very imaginative thinker. And he's got just such an array of knowledge of history. It's really amazing. Really impressive. And frankly, something that's been driven out of a lot of academia, because there's an increasing emphasis on specificity, on being really knowledgeable about some very specific things, and also with particular emphases now, shaped by modern cultural politics, for good or for ill. Tied in with that is the increasing emphasis upon kind of producing publications all the time. So you need to be quite limited in your scope to do that. So somebody like AM is really impressive to me because he's able to do the specifics, but understand them in the vast narrative of history. And that's really worth, just really great. So I'd thoroughly recommend checking out his channel. Fully agreed. Fully agreed. And yeah, you put it much better than I had. Just scrolling through. Yep. Maybe we should have him on here sometime. I've been on his channel a few times and it's been great fun talking about the Lord of the Rings. And who knows, there may be some more in the future. We'll need to wait and see. Let's see. Well, so I'm getting a lot of Sargon chat, and I'm not going to go into that bloodbath. I know there's a lot of disagreement there. This is a very interesting point. And I think one of the things that struck me recently is actually a lot of people talk about moving beyond right and left, but don't, in terms of they see the value of uh, engaging with politics in a paradigm which isn't left and right, but then we'll continue using words like leftist and rightist. So I'd encourage you all not to use that language anymore, just because, as this comment in many ways points out, there are so many different points of view categorized under right. In part, that's a great polemical tool for people who are because they can tar everybody with the brush of one group, right? But also, it just leads to confusion. And it's not really the lines on which things are to be drawn anymore. I think also its weakness is, and this is a broader point, the idea that politics is the primary activity in society, when actually politics is one sphere. There are many others, such as music, because the ways human communities are formed, the state is not everything. Even in countries where the state is dominant and totalitarian, you have civil society, those voluntary associations and institutions, which play such a fundamental role in any functioning group. Right and left is their political language, and they're tied to kind of notions of state, and thus belie the false idea that actually civil society is subservient to politics. Whereas actually, in many ways, each sphere of civil society, so education, health, religion, so on, they all have an important role to play just as much as politics. So I would move away from such language if you can, and identify other people and yourselves beyond these words, if you can. I know it's difficult because conversations sit in a certain way, right? Thanks. This must have been when I was singing earlier. Beautiful tunes, I think. Early modern tunes are so lovely and gorgeous. And if you haven't, I'm going to let me see if I can find it. There's a channel which has the music of Alexander Montgomery and selected others' tunes on YouTube, and I absolutely love it. Let's see. Can I get there? This is a great channel, and I find it very relaxing to listen to. So check it out. Yeah, I hope so. If not, I've been talking to myself for the last few hours. Oh, I see. I see. You're going to come back later. No worries. This is an interesting one. I think Dylan's voice adds a lot to his music. But I definitely know what you mean. It can be grating, but I think he makes the most of it, and it allows him to focus on the words in a way that if you have a more melodic voice, you're focusing more on the tune, whereas Dylan can really get the words across in a way that's sometimes more effective. I think that's also the case with like Mark Knopfler, who's not a great singer, but because of that, the words become all the more important. I see we've kind of got to the blues bit here. Yeah, lots of you guys all know so much. I feel I feel like I'm preaching to the choir in many ways. So keep scrolling down. Yeah, he knows his stuff, and that's the thing. Like I know this stream hasn't been like on that, so I appreciate you guys being here nonetheless. And yeah, will do. I did not know. I will check out Sun House. And that's a good point, to be fair. Like, a lot of this music is really good. Like, it's quality stuff. It's not just, we often think, oh, a guy with his guitar, but it's great guitar playing and great singing. That's a fair point. And I think that culture needs to be recognized. But certainly the blues, as it became mainstream, or the kind of blues values which were mainstreamed, were not those of the guys who go to church on a Sunday morning. Certainly, it wasn't kind of related to that. When you get to the kind of 60s, that aspect of it is totally kicked out of the way, which is it's sad, really. Yep, convincing the world that he doesn't exist. Hello, Vingle. I haven't. I will check this out. I did not know this, but that sounds like just such a great thing to share. So thank you, and I'll check that out because that seems so important for understanding Dylan and the whole movement. I'm going to keep going because this isn't something I know too much about, so I'm not going to comment on the discussion that was had by you guys there. Okay, I don't know what this refers to, but yeah. Oh, I see what we're referring to now. Yeah, that's the downside of it. It kept the economy going, but at what cost? And it's particularly worrying how the New Zealand is now throwing its lot in with China too. It's a real. It is very concerning from a British point of view, particularly given Biden seems to be very pro-China in some ways, has various connections with China, and then even our own government was tempted to allow Huawei to be involved in the development of our 5G network. So this is not a good time in that regard for kind of recognizing the threat that China raises, which is very real. And certainly I was shocked but not surprised to see reports that in many Scottish universities, which have large ties to kind of China, there's been a number of cases of kind of subterfuge going on and whatnot. And very little's being done about it because of the money, posing a real threat to certain students on campus. It's not good times, and it doesn't seem like there's going to be much reversal in the near future. But, and this is the key thing, that China's not it's not the enemy. It's actually, well, you guys don't need to know, but as Dylan says, like, you serve Satan or Jesus, right? So there's higher values at stake. Yeah, that was a lot of fun, and really enjoyed it. I loved his Apostolic Majesty's kind of explanation of Rohan as the Goths, mixed with who was the other group? I can't remember now. But yeah, was it the Romans? No, that can't be right. Anyway, that was a good stream. Love Van Morrison. He's another one a bit like Dylan. A lot of his music's very Christian when you look at it. Yeah, Knopfler has aged like a fine wine. That doesn't surprise me. He's always been quite red-pilled and unafraid to speak his mind, which is always a good thing. But again, I think that's in part because of his Christianity, that he serves a higher master and thus isn't beheld to the same standards as other people, just because he's not. That's his primary concern. Yeah, give it a listen. Yeah, and fully agree with that. Yeah, it's I know that this was a discussion the other night on was it Unpopular Opinions? Yeah, so I mean, I think the thing is though, like as we all kind of point out, that this is not the ultimate concern, but it is a concern, and it's a real shame that it is bound up with a lot of these other things to do with culture, because so much of our material culture is produced by China or in China, and we've outsourced our kind of industry and so on to China. So I think that's where it gets bound up with all of these cultural issues. So yeah, we'll see what happens. Yeah, that's right. And I think, but Apostolic Majesty was saying that it was the Goths and somebody else who could have been an influence. But I just can't remember who it was, unfortunately. But yeah, certainly Gondor as Jerusalem and the New Jerusalem, which is it's quite a inspiring thing in that regard. Tolkien, could do a whole stream on that, couldn't we? Another stream, but yeah. Does anybody have any further questions or comments before we go? We've got a bit of time, so while you guys are thinking up anything, just a kind of heads up for the next few weeks or so. I may do a couple of streams soon. One will probably be on similarist topic again. So last week we looked at spiritual transformation. Well, a couple of weeks ago, sorry. Spiritual transformation, Thomas Chalmers, and kind of the importance of reforming or giving not just a negative attack on what somebody desires, but trying to change their desires by giving them something more beautiful to desire, i.e., Jesus Christ. Right, that was Chalmers' argument. And one of the things that's missing in Chalmers, or kind of one of the things assumed in Chalmers, is a very individualistic account of human kind of desire and spiritual transformation, which is probably, well, it just isn't the case for most people. Rather, it often happens that we don't just change from one ideology to another, we change from one ideological community to another in some way or another. So the next stream will probably be on kind of in the Reformation, how the Protestants attempted to create a new community which
medieval Catholics would join and what kind of techniques they used to do that. Today we've looked at one of those, which is the transformation of popular music. But there are others, and I think that is that is a it'll be really interesting because I think today there's more of a move. There's more people are keen to create new communities in an online sphere in particular, but elsewhere. And people want to change. They want spiritual transformation, but they do. They don't have that. They're not tapping into that older resource of community building, of culture changing. So yeah, I think that would be of interest, and maybe give some ideas for people in terms of that. Then beyond that, we'll see. We'll see. There's I could do some more Dylan at some point, looking at some lyrics and so on. But yeah, I think that would be good. So, does anybody? Yep. Thank you, Lady of Charlotte. I really appreciate you joining, and it's great that you're able to watch live because I know you're all the way over the other side of the world. So really appreciate that, and I'm grateful too. Thank you, Great White Lobster, Matthew Sard as well. I want to thank you for all your comments, and Vingus. Is it Vingus? Vingle, sorry, Vingle. Thank you for joining, and to everybody else who's joined. I've really enjoyed it, and I hope you have too, and learn some things. And yeah, everybody keep well, keep safe, and hope to see you soon. Till then, God's blessings be with you always. May your wishes all come true. May you always do for others as others do for you.